So what I wanted to do was I wanted to talk about the first part of our class for English 300. And what we're going to spend the first couple weeks doing is we're going to talk about rhetoric and argument. And what you have to understand is the rhetoric and argument part of class is loads of fun. Students love the rhetoric and argument part of class. It's always fun. And it's a great way to kind of really focus on those critical thinking skills as well. So what I'm going to do is just kind of give you a 5 to 10 minute lecture kind of talking about rhetoric and argument. And then afterwards there's a kind of a short discussion board question that you'll answer on Canvas. So if we look at rhetoric and argument, the first thing you should know is that rhetoric and argument are linked. You can't have one without the other. So before we can start talking about argument, we have to talk about rhetoric. So if this was a ground class, the first thing I would ask students is I would say, okay, let's define rhetoric. And you should see students' face in a ground class. There are students who are just panicked, right? Some people look like they're going to cry. Some people start shaking, right? So if you're in a position right now where you're like, I don't know what rhetoric is, right? No big deal. That's what this lecture is supposed to kind of help you out with, right? Because they're in a ground class, you know, there's some students who say they've never heard the term rhetoric. There's some students who said they've heard the term rhetoric, but they don't know what it means. And then it's really fun with the students who have heard the term rhetoric. We can kind of play with how they define rhetoric. So before we can define rhetoric, I'm going to kind of break up rhetoric into 3 parts. And the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about people who use rhetoric, right? Because I think if we can have an understanding of people who use rhetoric, then we can understand how to better define rhetoric. So in a ground class, I would ask, okay, let's talk about the people who use rhetoric. And there are 2 groups of people that students can always associate with rhetoric. Even if they've never heard the word, they don't know what the word means, people can always associate. And the first group of people is politicians. Students can always associate rhetoric with politicians. And if you think about it, we just got out of a really nasty political campaign last year. And if you think about it right, somewhere along the lines you might have heard someone saying Donald Trump is using rhetoric, or Joe Biden has been using rhetoric. Okay, so might have heard that word. I don't know what it means, but it's always safe to associate politicians with using rhetoric. The second group that students always associate rhetoric with is lawyers. Lawyers are always associated with rhetoric. So we can think about, okay, so politicians use rhetoric, lawyers use rhetoric, right? Sometimes rhetoric can be associated with, can be associated. So we know that there are people who use rhetoric. Then I want to talk about forms of rhetoric. So if we talk about a form of rhetoric, I always ask students, okay, if we know that politicians use rhetoric, right, I always ask students, and I'll use the example of Barack Obama, but I say, if Barack Obama were to come on this video right now and he was using rhetoric, what would he do? What would he be doing? And so students say, well, he'd be talking, right? He'd be giving a speech. So a form of rhetoric is a speech. Right, a speech is probably the most popular form of rhetoric. And then I ask students, well, how many students have seen Barack Obama live in person give a speech? And every once in a while I might have someone who has, but most people have not seen him live in person. Well, I said, how is it possible that you've seen Obama speak but not live in person? And they'll say through TV, right? So notice a form of rhetoric could be TV, or radio might be a form of rhetoric. That would mean that, right, technology could be a form of rhetoric. You might think of things like the internet as a form of rhetoric. If we think about a form of rhetoric would be books. Well, if books are a form of rhetoric, that might mean a writer would be the person who used rhetoric. Newspaper would be a form of rhetoric. That means a journalist would be the person that uses rhetoric. So if you think about it, all we've done is we've said, look, here are the people who use rhetoric. Politicians, lawyers, writers, these all might be people who use rhetoric, right? We know the form of rhetoric could be a speech, TV, newspapers, right? So I'm going to give you my definition of rhetoric. And my definition of rhetoric is words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. So my definition of rhetoric is words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and con people. And so here's what I want you to do for your discussion board question, right? I basically am going to ask you, I want to know, based on this lecture, and there's going to be a couple other videos that I want you to kind of look at that might give you a little broader context of rhetoric. But I want to know, based on my definition of rhetoric, how would you define rhetoric and why? Now, you can agree with my definition, you can disagree with my definition, but as of week 1, I'm going to maintain that my definition of rhetoric is words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. And what I'll do is I'll look over your discussion boards. I'm looking forward to seeing what you think about how you define rhetoric, and then it'll give us a sort of a context to play with things. So just have fun with this discussion board, and as a rule with the discussion boards, you will post a discussion board and then you'll respond to another student's discussion as well.